I never believed in Bigfoot, not until I bought that mountain cabin and saw what my trail cameras captured. Even now, the memories of that place still haunt my dreams. I'm only telling this story because people deserve to know what really happens deep in those forests. It all started when my wife and I were searching for a weekend getaway. We'd been city people for years, working nonstop, barely seeing each other except when we collapsed into bed each night. We needed somewhere to escape to reconnect, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. The problem was our budget. Real estate prices had skyrocketed, and anything remotely decent was way out of reach. Then I stumbled upon a listing online, a log cabin in the North Cascades, about 40 miles from the nearest town, sitting on 20 acres of untouched forest. The photos looked incredible, a rustic cabin with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and miles of pristine wilderness in every direction. But the price made me hesitate, $30,000. To put that in perspective, other properties in the area were going for at least $200,000. My first thought was that it had to be a scam. No one sells a mountain property that cheap unless there's something seriously wrong with it. Maybe a cracked foundation, no road access, or some kind of legal mess. But the more I looked, the more legitimate it seemed. The seller had uploaded interior photos, a full property survey, even offered to meet us there in person for a viewing. When I showed the listing to my wife that evening, she was skeptical at first. She scrolled slowly through the photos on her laptop, her expression shifting from doubt to quiet fascination. She had to admit it was beautiful. She stopped at a photo of the great room, with its massive timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out into the woods. "But why is it so cheap?" she asked. "What aren't they telling us?" I was wondering the same thing, but sometimes you've got to take a risk. We were both burned out from city life, desperate for a place to recharge. Even if the cabin needed work, even if there were problems we couldn't see in the photos, $30,000 was a risk we could live with. That night, we called the seller. His name was Dave. He sounded older, maybe around 60. When I asked about the low price, he paused for a moment before explaining that the property had been in his family for decades, but no one used it anymore. He wanted it to go to someone who would appreciate it, someone who understood what it meant to live close to nature. There was something weary in his voice, maybe even relieved, as if he couldn't wait to be done with it. But his eagerness worked in our favor. We agreed to meet him at the property that Saturday. The drive took about 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until we found a narrow gravel path that seemed to go on forever. The last 5 miles were especially rough, rutted, and strewn with rocks that made me worry we'd blow a tire. But when we finally crested the hill and saw the cabin nestled below, surrounded by towering pines and ferns glistening in the sunlight, all my doubts disappeared. It was even more beautiful than in the photos. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, forest on 3 sides, and an open view to the north, where endless mountain ridges faded into the horizon. The structure itself looked solid. Thick log walls sealed with fresh mortar, a metal roof that seemed recently replaced, and a massive stone chimney rising above the trees. Dave was waiting for us on the front porch, a tall, wiry man with sun-browned hands and tired eyes. He gave us a tour inside, and to my surprise, everything was in great condition. The main floor was one large open space, with a cozy living area, a compact kitchen, and a small bathroom tucked in the corner. Upstairs, beneath the sloped rafters, was a single loft bedroom overlooking the forest canopy. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. As we walked the property line, I kept expecting Dave to mention some hidden flaw, maybe a dry well, a broken septic system, or a boundary dispute that would make ownership complicated. But the longer we stayed, the more it felt like we'd stumbled upon something remarkable. It wasn't until we were getting ready to leave that Dave finally mentioned the wildlife. We were standing beside my truck, going over the sale details, when he glanced toward the tree line and casually remarked that the local animals had been more active than usual. He suggested we install a security system if we planned to stay long-term. My wife asked what kind of wildlife he meant, and Dave shrugged. "Mostly black bears, some mountain lions," he said. "Predators are getting bolder these days, coming closer to the cabins. You'll want to store your food carefully." His advice made sense for any mountain property, so we didn't think much of it. We shook hands and drove home that night, already planning our first weekend getaway. The paperwork went through faster than any real estate deal I'd ever seen. Dave seemed eager to get everything finalized. He even called our lawyer twice to make sure there wouldn't be delays. Within 3 weeks, we officially owned the cabin. Before our first trip up there, I decided to take Dave's advice about security. I didn't want bears tearing into the place while we were gone, so I ordered a set of motion-triggered trail cameras with night vision. They weren't cheap, but they felt like a smart investment to protect our little mountain hideaway. On our way up that first weekend, I stopped at the local ranger station to introduce myself and ask for any advice about the area. The ranger on duty, a woman named Sarah, was friendly enough when I mentioned we'd bought Dave's old place. But her expression changed the moment I told her where it was. "That's pretty remote," she said, pulling out a topographic map and asking me to point out the exact spot. When I told Sarah we planned to make the cabin a regular weekend retreat, she frowned and leaned over the counter. She enthusiastically recommended the trail cameras I'd mentioned. "Predator activity in that drainage," she said, "had increased over the past few years. Mostly bears, but also the occasional mountain lion. They weren't usually aggressive toward people, but sometimes they got curious about new scents and sounds." She marked several spots on a topographic map, showing us the best places to mount the cameras for maximum coverage around the cabin. Her advice was detailed and practical, but there was an undercurrent of unease in her voice that made me wonder if she was telling us everything she knew. My wife asked if there had been any incidents up there, anything we should be aware of. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "Nothing new," she said. "Just store your food carefully and make sure you've got some way to contact us if you need to. Cell coverage is patchy, but you can usually get a signal if you hike up the ridge." We thanked her for the advice and continued up the mountain, both of us eager for our first night in the new cabin. The drive felt even longer than I remembered, and we arrived just as the sun was slipping behind the western peaks. The cabin looked magical in the golden light. We spent that first evening installing the trail cameras around the property. I placed them according to Sarah's recommendations, focusing on the main approaches to the cabin and the areas most frequented by wildlife. Each camera had about a 30-foot detection range and could shoot stills and video when triggered by motion. Working in the fading light took longer than expected, but we managed to mount and test all 6 before nightfall. Inside, we cooked a simple dinner on the gas stove and sat by the fireplace with a bottle of wine. Finally, we could relax and enjoy our new hideaway. That first night was everything we'd hoped for, the kind of silence you forget exists after years in the city. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors, just the occasional owl call or the whisper of wind in the trees. We slept better than we had in months, wrapped in thick blankets while the fire sank to glowing coals. The next morning, I couldn't wait to check the cameras and see what wildlife had wandered by. I carried my laptop from one unit to the next, downloading the data while my wife made breakfast. Most of the footage was exactly what I expected. A few deer moving through the timber, a raccoon nosing around the cabin's foundation, something like a fox trotting down one of the trails. Normal mountain animals doing their normal mountain business. But one camera, the one on the north side of the property where the forest grew thickest, had caught something more interesting. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. The black and white night image was grainy and hard to make out. At first glance, it looked like another deer. But when I zoomed in, the shape was all wrong. Whatever had triggered the camera was large and dark, standing right at the edge of the detection range. The motion sensor had captured only a single frame before the figure moved out of sight. I couldn't tell much about its behavior, but the outline was too tall and broad for a deer, too upright for a bear on all fours. I called my wife over to look. She barely glanced at it before taking a sip of her coffee. "Probably just a bear standing up to get a better look," she said. "Don't they do that sometimes?" She wasn't wrong. Black bears often rear up on their hind legs to sniff or investigate something new. The camera had probably caught one sizing up our presence in its territory. I reminded myself to be careful with food storage and pushed the image out of my mind. We spent the rest of that weekend hiking the property lines and exploring the surrounding woods. The land was even more beautiful than we'd imagined: hidden meadows, a year-round creek, and views from the ridge that took your breath away. When it was time to pack up and return to the city, we were already planning our next visit. It ended up being a full month before we could make it back. Work swallowed our time and family obligations ate up the weekends. But finally, we carved out a long weekend and drove back up the mountain, eager to settle into our hideaway again. The cabin was just as we'd left it, but I noticed right away that the cameras had been busy in our absence. Several units showed dozens of triggers, mostly the usual suspects: deer, squirrels, the occasional bird flying too close to the sensor. But as I downloaded the data, a pattern began to emerge. The same massive, dark shape had appeared on multiple cameras over the past month, always at night, always at the edge of the detection zone. The images were maddeningly blurry, but there was no question something big was out there. Something big enough to trip the motion sensors again and again. The most unsettling images came from the camera near the cabin's back door. In one night 2 weeks earlier, something had come much closer than before. The sequence showed its approach. First, a dark mass at the edge of the frame, then closer, then a hulking shape right at the limit of the sensor. The final frame was the clearest I'd ever seen. A towering black figure standing upright, definitely bipedal, with what looked like 2 long arms hanging at its sides. The night vision gave everything a ghostly, unreal look, but the basic structure of its body was unmistakable. This wasn't a bear rearing up for a second. This was a creature whose natural posture was on 2 legs. This time, my wife studied the images more carefully. She zoomed in on the details, flipped through the sequence again and again. "That's strange," she admitted. "What do you think it is?" I didn't want to say the thought forming in my mind. The figure was too tall for a human, too massive for any animal I knew. It moved with intention and intelligence, coming closer to the cabin and seemingly observing it before retreating back into the trees. "Maybe we should ask Sarah about it next time we're in town," I suggested. "She might know what kind of animals are active out here." But privately, I was already forming a hypothesis I didn't want to admit. The shape, the stance, the clear intelligence behind how it approached all of it pointed towards something that wasn't supposed to exist. That second weekend, we decided to take a more systematic approach to the mystery. I repositioned several cameras to better cover the cabin's approaches, and we made a point of checking for physical evidence around the property. It didn't take long to find it. Near the back corner of the cabin, where the mysterious figure had been photographed most recently, we discovered tracks in a patch of soft earth. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Massive prints, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches across at their widest point. But what disturbed me most was their shape, clearly made by something bipedal, with 5 distinct toes and what looked like an arch and heel, but the proportions were all wrong for a human foot. Too long, too wide, the toes almost prehensile. We counted 7 tracks in total, leading from the tree line to within 10 feet of the back wall of the cabin, then veering off and returning to the woods along a slightly different path. Whatever had made those tracks had clearly approached the cabin on purpose, lingered close for a while, then retreated. The depth of the impressions suggested something enormously heavy, far heavier than any human, even a very large one. I measured each print carefully and photographed them from multiple angles while my wife searched the area for other signs. Near the tree line, she found branches snapped off at roughly 8 feet high, and several trees bore fresh scratches far above our reach. That night, sitting by the fire and trying to make sense of what we'd discovered, I finally said out loud the possibility we'd both been avoiding. "What if it's Bigfoot?" I asked, feeling ridiculous even as the words left my mouth. My wife laughed, but it was a thin, nervous laugh. "Oh, come on," she said. "You don't actually believe that stuff, do you?" I admitted I didn't, but I pointed at the evidence anyway. The massive footprints, the broken branches at impossible height, the upright figure in the photos. What else fits? We spent the next hour hunched over my phone, struggling to hold a weak signal near the south-facing window, searching for Bigfoot sightings. What we found was both fascinating and unnerving. The Pacific Northwest has more Bigfoot reports than anywhere else in the country, with dozens of credible sightings recorded every year. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A huge, hair-covered biped standing 7 to 8 feet tall, intelligent yet elusive, avoiding direct contact with humans. The most chilling part was that our area in particular had its own cluster of reports. A quick search turned up at least 6 sightings within 50 miles of our cabin in the past decade, each describing eerily similar encounters with a massive, hard-to-see creature apparently watching human activity from a distance. "Maybe that's why Dave sold the place so cheap," my wife suggested. Maybe he ran into this thing and just wanted out. It made a twisted kind of sense. Dave had been eager, almost desperate to finalize the sale, and his warnings about wildlife, though vague, were oddly firm. If he'd been living with a Bigfoot prowling his property for years, it would explain both his reluctance to talk about it and his rush to unload the cabin. We stayed up late that night, jumping at every sound outside. The forest, which had felt so peaceful on our previous visits, now seemed to bristle with hidden watchers. Every gust of wind in the branches, every owl call, every rustle in the underbrush made us wonder if the unseen visitor was out there, just beyond the camera's reach. Nothing happened that night, but the next morning when I checked the cameras, I discovered our guest had indeed returned. Multiple units had been triggered throughout the night, showing the same dark figure moving around the property with increasing boldness. The most unsettling footage came from the camera along the main approach to the cabin. Over a span of 2 hours, the motion sensor recorded the creature circling closer and then retreating. The pauses, long stretches of stillness, showed it had stopped just outside the detection range before moving again. But this time, one of the middle frames had captured something new. The image was still grainy and full of noise, but it showed the creature's face looking directly into the camera. Large, intelligent eyes reflected the infrared glow, framed by a heavy brow casting shadows over features that looked disturbingly human. The face was covered in dark hair, but the bone structure beneath was almost man-like. If a person could be that massive, that powerful, this is what it would look like. That afternoon, we packed up and headed back to the city, both of us deeply unsettled by what we'd seen. On the drive down, we debated whether to report our discovery to anyone. But who would believe us? What would we even report some blurry photos and a set of oversized footprints? In the weeks that followed, the mystery consumed me. I read everything I could find about Bigfoot encounters, watched documentaries, combed through witness statements, studied the grainy photos and videos, the only evidence this creature left behind. Most of it was clearly hoaxes or misidentifications, but there were enough credible reports from trustworthy people to make me think there might be something real behind it all. The more I read, the more our situation made sense. Bigfoot encounters almost always happen in remote places where the creatures feel safe from humans. They're curious about human activity, but avoid direct contact, preferring to watch from a distance, and they seem especially drawn to occupied structures, as if fascinated by the presence of people. Our cabin fit that pattern perfectly, isolated, surrounded by wilderness, and already visited by something that matched every classic description. By the time we planned our third trip a month later, I was determined to collect clearer evidence of whatever we were sharing the property with. I upgraded the camera system to higher resolution units capable of sharper night shots, and repositioned them strategically based on the creature's previous movement patterns. This time we planned to stay a full week, partly to disconnect from city life. But if I was honest, also because I hoped for a closer encounter with our elusive neighbor. The first night passed quietly, but the atmosphere around the cabin felt different, like we were being watched. My wife felt it too, though we tried not to let paranoia spoil the getaway we'd been looking forward to. On the second night, our visitor made its presence known in a much more dramatic way. We went to bed around 10:30 after a long day of hiking the high meadows above our land. I had just drifted off when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was a deer or an elk crossing the clearing, but as I listened more closely, I realized the footfalls had a rhythm and caution, unlike any four-legged animal. Heavy, deliberate steps. The measured tread of something walking upright, circling the cabin at a distance of maybe 50 feet. I shook my wife awake, and we lay there listening as the footsteps completed a slow loop around the building. Every so often, they stopped as if whoever was out there had paused to examine something, then resumed their steady pace. The noises went on for nearly 20 minutes before fading back toward the trees. Neither of us slept after that. Every rustle outside ratcheted our nerves tighter, and we lay there wondering if our visitor had returned. By daylight, we were exhausted and still eager to see what the cameras had caught. The results were equal parts frustrating and alarming. Several units had triggered overnight, but most showed nothing but empty forest or a fleeting glimpse of something large slipping between the trees. Worse was what we found when we checked the installations themselves. 3 of the 6 cameras had been moved, not knocked askew, moved, angled to stare at useless directions. The unit that had covered the main approach now pointed straight at a trunk 6 meters away. Another had been rotated to film the cabin itself. Whatever visited us last night not only noticed the cameras, it understood what they were for and tried to neutralize them. That level of intelligence scared me. We spent the morning resetting every device and combing the clearing for physical sign. The tracks were clearer and more numerous than before, forming a rough circle around the cabin at almost exactly the distance I'd estimated from the footsteps. More disturbing were the marks on the surrounding trees. Deep gouges in the bark, 7 to 10 feet off the ground, about 2.13 meters, as if something extremely tall had been marking territory or venting its anger. Some of the scratches were fresh, the inner bark still pale where claws or fingernails had raked through the outer layer. Near the front porch, we found a section of railing ruined. The thick post bore what looked like bite marks punched deep into the wood, too large and too strong for any known predator in the area. That afternoon, while exploring a ravine about half a mile from the cabin, we made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a tangle of raspberry canes and fallen logs was a shelter, clearly artificial. Branches and timbers had been arranged with deliberate design, forming a windbreak large enough for a very big creature to sleep inside. The workmanship was sophisticated, an understanding of load and leverage far beyond any animal den I'd ever seen. Smaller limbs were woven between larger braces to create walls, and the whole structure was so well camouflaged we nearly walked past it. Inside, we found even more evidence of habitation. A shallow depression lined with dried grass and leaves formed a bed wide enough for something 8 feet tall, about 2.4 meters. Scattered around were objects that looked like tools, sharp-edged stones suitable for cutting, sturdy sticks worn smooth as if used for digging, even something like a rough bowl carved from soft wood. The worst was a pile of bones in one corner deer, and smaller animals snapped methodically to get at the marrow. The break patterns suggested a level of strength far beyond what a person could manage with simple tools. We didn't linger. The place felt private, violated by our presence, and I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched from the shadows. We snapped a few quick photos and hurried back to the cabin, shaken by what we'd found. That night, we tried to pretend nothing had changed. We cooked dinner and sat by the fire as if there wasn't proof of a large, intelligent resident living a stone's throw from our refuge. But fear seeped into everything. We jumped at every sound. Around midnight, our worst fear arrived. We were lying awake in the loft when something slammed into the cabin wall. The impacts were monstrous, hard enough to shudder the entire structure and rattle the window frames. They came in a steady rhythm, as if something was methodically testing the building's strength. The pounding moved across the cabin, starting at the rear wall, migrating to the sides, and finally battering the front. When it reached the porch, we heard the railing crack and splinter. Something powerful was out there, trying to get in. My wife gripped my hand as the blows kept coming. The timbers groaned under the strain, and for the first time I worried the walls might actually fail. The place was solid, but it wasn't built to withstand that kind of assault. After nearly 10 minutes, the attack stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the pounding. We held our breath, imagining whatever was out there preparing for another, more serious breach. Gradually, the forest sounds returned. A distant owl, a branch creaking in the wind. It seemed our attacker had given up and withdrawn. We didn't sleep. We huddled in the loft and listened for any sign it had come back. The rest of the night passed without incident. Morning revealed the cost. The outer walls were dented and scored where something had hammered them with enormous force. The porch railing was a total loss. Heavy posts snapped like kindling and strewn across the clearing. Worst were the gouges around the windows and doors, deep rakes in the wood as if giant claws had searched for purchase. The marks were too large and too deep to blame on any known predator. When we checked the cameras, most were destroyed, smashed, not merely moved. Only 2 had survived, and their cards held nothing but darkness and the snap of timber tearing. We should have left right then. Any sensible person would have packed up and driven as far as possible. But we'd sunk everything we had into this place, and walking away felt impossible. Besides, whatever was out there had already had plenty of chances to harm us and hadn't. Maybe it wanted us gone, not dead. So we stayed. We spent the day hardening the cabin's defenses. We found sheets of plywood in the shed and nailed them over the ground floor windows. We stacked furniture against the doors and made sure we could reach the landline, only to discover it had been disconnected years ago. On the fourth night, a sharp crack of wood woke us. Something was trying to break the front door. The blows came steadily, each accompanied by the splintering report of wood and the ring of metal. We'd reinforced the door as best we could, but it was obvious whatever stood outside had the power to punch through if it really committed. We curled up in the loft, holding each other while the assault dragged on for hours, pounding on the door, claws rasping along the siding, heavy weight shifting across the porch. And once, God help me, the sound of breathing right beside the window. But the door held. Thanks to the extra bracing, the frame survived the night. Morning told a harsher story. The jamb chewed up, the hinge side casing cracked, the surrounding timbers beginning to split. And then we found the detail that changed everything. Our truck wouldn't start. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck. Maybe the battery was dead, or maybe some simple mechanical issue could be fixed with a wrench. But when I opened the hood and looked inside, my stomach dropped. The tires weren't just flat, they were shredded. Long, deliberate slashes cut clean through the rubber and into the rims. The engine compartment was worse. Wiring hung in tangled clumps ripped out by force. Hoses and belts had been cut or torn apart. It wasn't an accident. The truck had been sabotaged systematically, intelligently, and it would take serious repairs before it could ever move again. We were trapped. The nearest town was 40 miles away, linked only by rugged mountain roads that would be suicide to walk. We had enough food for maybe 3 days. Our phones showed no signal anywhere on the property, and the landline had been dead for years, probably disconnected by Dave long before he listed the place. For the first time since buying the cabin, I felt genuine fear. Whatever was sharing this mountain with us had made sure we couldn't leave. Somehow, it wanted us here, and that thought terrified me more than anything we'd faced so far. All that day, we searched for a plan. The southern ridge was the only place with a faint cell signal, but it was a steep, treacherous climb. If something happened, if one of us fell or got hurt, we might never make it back. But staying put wasn't an option either. Our unseen neighbor had grown bolder with each visit, and the cabin's defenses were failing. It was only a matter of time before it found a way inside. That evening, we stumbled on a flicker of hope. In the storage shed, Dave had left behind an emergency kit, first aid supplies, a water filter, and best of all, a set of emergency flares. If we could reach the ridge and get a signal, the flares would help rescuers pinpoint our location, even at night. We also found something else. An old journal hidden behind a stack of boxes in the basement. The entries dated back to the early 1990 seconds, written by someone named Michael, who seemed to have owned the cabin before Dave. The final pages were deeply unsettling. Michael described encounters eerily similar to ours, something large and intelligent, prowling around at night, tearing up equipment, trying to break in. But his situation had escalated far beyond what we'd experienced. According to his writing, the creature had eventually forced its way inside while he was away on a supply run. When he returned, he found the interior destroyed, furniture overturned, walls damaged, his food supply scattered and fouled. The most disturbing detail was his description of what he called territorial markings all over the cabin. The last entry was written 2 days later. He said the creature was back, trying to break in again, but this time he was trapped inside with no escape. The writing ended abruptly. The rest of the pages were gone. Reading those words under the dim lantern light while the same heavy footsteps circled the cabin, claws scraping at the siding, was unbearable. We realized we were following in the path of someone who had likely never made it out. We couldn't wait any longer. At first light, one of us would have to try to reach the ridge and call for help. I volunteered. My wife was the better hiker, but I couldn't stand the idea of leaving her alone if something happened to me. We agreed that she'd stay to guard the cabin while I made the climb. If I got a signal, I'd call for rescue and fire a flare to let her know the message had gone through. If I didn't return by nightfall, she'd barricade herself inside and wait for help to arrive. Neither of us slept that fifth night. We heard noises again, movement around the clearing, the soft scrape of something testing the barriers. It felt like the creature somehow knew we were planning to leave and was determined to stop us. Just before dawn, everything went silent. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise, but it gave us the chance we needed. I packed quickly: a canteen, The emergency flares, a small hatchet we'd found in the shed. My wife watched from the upstairs window as I slipped out the back door. The forest was still black, with only the faintest hint of gray on the eastern horizon. I knew the route well enough now. If I moved fast, I could reach the ridge before the thing realized I was gone. The first part of the climb went smoothly. The forest floor was open enough for quick progress, though the ground was rough and uneven. But as I gained altitude, the slope steepened, and fallen logs and loose rocks slowed me down. Halfway up, gasping for breath and stopping to rest, I realized I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a feeling, an awareness of eyes on me from somewhere below. Then, I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, something massive, moving parallel to my path. It stayed hidden, using the thick undergrowth to mask its advance. But I could see the branches swaying, hear the faint thud of heavy steps pushing through brush. Whatever followed me was large enough to leave a wake of motion through the forest. I forced myself to keep climbing, even as every instinct screamed for me to turn back or hide. The ridge was still at least an hour away, and I wasn't sure I could maintain the pace I needed to stay ahead of whatever was following me. My legs trembled from exhaustion, and the thin mountain air burned in my lungs. But I couldn't stop. My wife was counting on me, and we both knew that rescue was our only real chance of survival. As I climbed higher, the creature grew bolder. I caught fleeting glimpses of it moving between the trees, a dark, hulking shape gliding through the forest with a silence that no animal its size should have been capable of. It was tracking me, no doubt about it. Probably still 100 yards behind, but closing in. The final stretch to the ridge was the steepest yet. I clawed my way up over loose rocks and exposed roots, every muscle screaming. By the time I dragged myself over the ledge and saw the vast expanse of wilderness below, a surge of hope broke through the fear. 2 bars of signal blinked onto my phone screen. With shaking hands, I fumbled to dial 911, praying the connection would hold long enough for the call to go through. After what felt like an eternity, a voice answered, a dispatcher from the county sheriff's office. I gave her our location as best I could, explaining that we were stranded and needed immediate rescue. She asked questions: how many of us, what condition we were in, whether we were safe for now. I stumbled through my answers, carefully avoiding the truth. How do you tell a 911 operator that you're being stalked by something that might be Bigfoot? She assured me a search and rescue team would be deployed as soon as possible, but warned it would take several hours to get a helicopter into such a remote area. I thanked her, promised I'd return to the cabin to wait, and ended the call. Then I turned to fire the flare and froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing, barely 50 feet away, was the creature we had shared our property with. It was even larger than I had imagined from the blurry camera stills, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders like a bear's and arms that hung nearly to its knees. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark brown hair, coarse like a wild animal's, but longer and more human in the way it draped across the body. But it was the face that paralyzed me. Intelligent, aware. The deep-set eyes, almost black, studied me not with malice, but with unmistakable curiosity. We stared at each other across that mountain clearing for what felt like forever, though it could not have been more than 30 seconds. I was rooted in place, part terror, part awe, unable to move or look away from those eyes. The creature stood perfectly still, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Then, without any sudden motion or aggression, it simply stepped backward and melted into the forest. One moment it was there, solid, undeniably real, and the next, it was gone among the trees, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. I stood alone on the ridge, shaking, wondering if I'd truly seen what I thought I had, or if exhaustion and fear had finally pushed me past the edge. But the crushed vegetation where it had stood was real enough. So was the lingering scent in the air, something musky, wild, and wrong. Not human, not animal, but something between the two. My primal brain screamed predator. I fired the emergency flare as planned. The red streak arced across the valley toward the cabin, trailing smoke like blood across the pale morning sky. Then I started back down the mountain, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible, stumbling through the undergrowth, glancing over my shoulder at every sound. The creature didn't follow, or at least, I never saw it again. But the sensation of being watched never left me. It was there in every snapping twig, every whisper of wind in the branches, as if it wanted to make sure I was really leaving its territory. I reached the cabin in record time, half running, half falling down the slopes. My wife met me at the door, tears in her eyes, relief flooding her face when she saw me alive. I told her about the call, the promise of rescue, but not about the encounter on the ridge. She'd already endured enough fear. She didn't need the image of that thing burned into her mind. We spent the rest of the day packing what little we could carry, patching the worst of the damage, waiting for the sound of salvation. We didn't talk much. Neither of us wanted to admit what we both knew. We would never set foot on this mountain again. Just before sunset, the deep thrum of rotor blades rolled through the valley. I've never heard a sound more beautiful. The rescue helicopter banked low over the ridge and descended toward the clearing in front of the cabin. Within minutes, we were airborne. As the cabin shrank below us, I glanced toward the tree line one last time and saw it. A tall, dark silhouette stood just beyond the trees, watching us lift away. Not hiding, not threatening, simply observing. The posture was almost peaceful, as if it was satisfied. We were leaving its land, and it could finally return to the solitude it seemed to prefer. The flight back to civilization took barely 20 minutes, an absurdly short distance for the ordeal that had nearly cost us our lives. From the air, the forest looked serene, untroubled, betraying no hint of the terror it concealed. The rescue crew was professional and efficient, asking only the essential questions. We told them the truth, at least part of it. Our truck had been damaged, and we'd been stranded. That was technically correct. They didn't press for details, and we didn't volunteer any. We never went back. Within a month, we sold the property to a local rancher who planned to use it as a seasonal hunting lodge. We took the same $30,000 we'd paid Dave and considered ourselves lucky to break even. A few months later, the rancher called. He said his construction crew had refused to keep working after only a few days on site. He didn't go into detail, and I didn't ask. They complained that their equipment was being moved or damaged overnight, that strange noises echoed from the forest after dark, and that there was a constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. Eventually, the rancher gave up on the idea of renovating the place. He used the land only for daytime hunting trips and refused to stay overnight. Even that didn't last long. His clients began to report the same things: eyes in the woods, the sense of being followed, enormous footprints pressed into the soft earth near their campsites. Within a year, he stopped using the property altogether. As far as I know, the cabin still stands there now, empty and decaying as the forest slowly reclaims it. And somewhere in those mountains, a creature unrecognized by science continues to exist in solitude, occasionally leaving behind a massive print in the mud or a fleeting shadow caught on a hiker's camera. I never filed a report with any official agency or research group. What would be the point? We had no convincing evidence, no clear photos, no proof that would persuade anyone who hadn't lived through what we did. All we had were a few blurry images and our own testimony, which isn't much to anyone who wasn't there. But I know what we saw on that mountain. I know what stalked us through those trees and finally drove us from our dream refuge. And sometimes, late at night, when the city grows quiet and I lie awake thinking of the cabin, I wonder if maybe we were the intruders all along. Maybe we were the ones who didn't belong up there. Perhaps the creature was simply protecting its home the only way it knew how, with fear. It never truly harmed us, never made a direct attack. It just made sure we understood that we weren't welcome in its territory. Over the years, I've read everything I could find about similar encounters. There are more reports than most people realize scattered across the Pacific Northwest and other remote wildernesses. People who have experienced the same haunting familiarity of being watched by something intelligent in the dark. The pattern is always the same: isolated properties, remote cabins, encounters with a massive, elusive being that keeps to itself until provoked or encroached upon. Most of the time, people leave voluntarily, just as we did. Sometimes, though, the stories end differently. A few unsettling accounts describe people who simply vanish. Their cars are found abandoned, their camps intact, but they're never seen again. Michael, the man who owned our cabin before Dave, might have been one of them. His journal ended mid-sentence, and no one ever found out what happened after those final words. I don't spend much time thinking about those possibilities anymore. We made it out alive. We learned an expensive but valuable lesson about being careful what you wish for and about the boundaries of the world we think we control. Now we live in the suburbs, surrounded by neighbors and the comforting hum of city life. Yet sometimes when I'm tending the small garden out back or sitting on the porch at dusk, I feel that same old sensation that someone, somewhere, is watching. It's probably just imagination, a ghost of memory from those nights on the mountain. Surely the creature never followed us here. There's no reason it would. We're no longer trespassing on its land. But the feeling lingers. I catch myself scanning the shadows between the houses or the tree line at the edge of the neighborhood park, because now I know there are things in this world that science hasn't classified. Beings that prefer to remain unseen but will defend what's theirs when they must. And once you've looked into the intelligent eyes of something that isn't supposed to exist, once you've felt the weight of its awareness, you can never go back to believing you're alone in the world. I still keep the old laptop locked away in our closet, the one with the trail cam footage on it. Those grainy, uncertain images could be anything or nothing at all, depending on who's looking. Sometimes I think about releasing them, adding our story to the growing archive of Bigfoot encounters that enthusiasts and researchers still debate. But what would that accomplish? The images aren't clear enough to prove anything, and our story would be dismissed as another hoax or a case of mistaken identity. That creature has evaded proof for generations, perhaps centuries. Who am I to change that? Maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. Maybe there are still places in this world where the old rules apply, where we are just another species struggling to survive, not the masters we imagine ourselves to be. Perhaps we need reminders that we are not alone on this planet and that not every unknown thing is meant to be discovered. The mountain cabin taught us that lesson, along with a healthy respect for the power of fear and the wisdom of knowing when you are not welcome somewhere. It was an expensive lesson, but one that has stayed with us ever since. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees in our suburban neighborhood, I swear I can still hear those heavy footsteps crossing invisible boundaries, whispering a reminder that this world is far stranger and more wonderful than most ever realize. We never speak about what happened up there, not even to each other. It has become one of those shared experiences, too vast, too unreal to put into words, something that binds us without needing to be discussed. We know what we saw, we know what we lived through, and that knowledge changed us in ways we are still discovering. But we survived. We are safe, and we've learned to appreciate the simple comforts of civilization's streetlights, locked doors, cell service, and neighbors close enough to hear if you scream. Things we once took for granted now feel like rare luxuries, gentle reminders that we live in a world mostly designed by and for human beings. Still, that creature in the mountains, it's out there. I'm certain of it. It still leaves footprints in the soft earth. It still triggers trail cameras from time to time. It still watches from the shadows when people wander too deep into its territory, carrying cameras and the arrogance that we are the only intelligent species on this planet. But I think it learned something too. It learned that humans can be driven away without violence, that fear is often far more effective than rage. And maybe, just maybe, it learned that not all humans are a threat to its existence. We respected its boundary. In the end, we left when it became clear we weren't welcome, and in return, it let us go unharmed. To me, that feels like a fair exchange. The cabin in the mountains still returns in my dreams, sometimes always peaceful, always beautiful, always wrapped in that vast wildness we fell in love with during those early visits. But even in the dream, I feel eyes watching from the trees, a quiet intelligence just beyond sight. I wake from those dreams with a strange mix of nostalgia and relief, nostalgia for the beauty and silence we sought in those mountains, and relief that I now wake to the mundane safety of suburbia, surrounded by trivial problems and the warmth of civilization. Because now I understand some dreams come with a price, and some mysteries are better left undisturbed. The Pacific Northwest still holds its secrets, still shelters creatures that prefer shadow to discovery, and maybe that's exactly how it should be. For more stories like this, stay tuned.